The 4-day week trials are very exciting because they're the first larger scale policy innovation toward work time reduction. There's a lot of social benefit and a number of different ways that it can be successful for the company or the organization. So it's a game changer.
Welcome to the PolicyNet podcast by the UNESCO Inclusive Policy Lab. This is the place where top thinkers come to talk data and solutions that reset us along a more fair and smart path. Today our guest is Juliette Schor. She is a sociology professor at Boston College and a best-selling author. Together we discuss the redesign of our traditional approaches to work. Juliette makes a case for reduction of work week from 5 to 4 days with no pay cuts. She's been trialing it around the world and explains the benefits for the employees.
Well-being measures are off the charts positive. 70% of people in these trials score lower on the burnout scale. Physical health, mental health, they score higher on life satisfaction and job satisfaction.
Juliette also explains the benefits of the 4-day week for companies and employers.
Many companies are telling us productivity has gone up, profitability has gone up, metrics for revenue, absenteeism, new hiring, resignations, and energy use. They are pretty positive.
But no policy succeeds on its own. Juliette explains what other solutions should be embraced by companies and governments to actually reap the benefits of the 4-day week.
Because the market power of low-wage workers is still so low. You need more help from government. Government can sponsor trials, start looking at legislation to reduce standard work weeks, and giving incentives for companies that are going to a 32-hour week.
I'm UNESCO's Yulia Shevchuk and I'm your host here. Juliette, there is a lot of experimentation going on nowadays, attempting to flesh out new solutions that actually deliver on the environmental and social fronts on top of the usual economic objectives. Your own work is concerned with trialing the 4-day week, meaning the reduction of the work week from 5 to 4 days with no pay cut. You've run such policy trials in Brazil, Canada, Australia, the UK, the US, South Africa, and many other places. So to start with, could you please tell us more about these trials and their designs?
Yes. Well, thank you for asking. These trials are, in my view, very exciting because they're the first larger scale policy innovation toward work time reduction in many places. So we began in February of 2022, and we have been running trials since then. They started in Ireland, the US, and then the UK. Every 2 months, we were starting a new trial. The UK trial was the biggest in history. It had about 70 companies. The format of the trials is that companies or nonprofits, and even we've had a few small government entities, sign on to them. They go through a process of 2 months of what we call work reorganization, in which they get coaching, webinars, peer mentors, and the community of other people also doing this to help them figure out how to make their workplace more efficient and how to get 5 days of work into 4 days. The big things that many of them tend to do is they make their meetings more efficient, shorter, fewer meetings, fewer people at them. They give people more time to really focus and reduce distraction. So all of those things can really help people to become more efficient and help the teams and the workplaces. So it's not primarily an individual thing, although that can be part of it, but it's a whole workplace coming together and saying, how can we do things better? Then after 2 months of that work reorganization process, we survey, and then they start the 4-day schedule. 6 months later, they finish it. We do data collection at midpoint and then at end point. We've also been surveying them a year out, and we'll go back at 2 years. We're not quite at 2 years yet.
Following up on what you just said, what is the usual size of the company included in these trials, and what are the industries? You mentioned non-profits, but are there other industries you cover?
In terms of size, we do have a distribution. The largest are about 1,000. We have 1 or 2 much bigger companies that only one smaller division took place. And even in the 1,000-person companies, a company of that size will start by doing a pilot within a pilot. In other words, they won't transition 1,000 people on an experimental basis. So we have an overrepresentation of small companies, and that's partly an artifact of the trials, because if you are a large company, you don't need to come to an NGO to do a change. You have your own researchers, you have your own consultants, and so forth. So we do skew small, but on the other hand, if you look at the size distribution of businesses around the world, small businesses make up a very, very large portion, even if they don't have that proportionate share of employment. In terms of industries, we have pretty much everything at this point, but a heavy skew toward white-collar work. The biggest industry at this point is professional services. So we have advertising, public relations, graphic design, lawyers, accountants, that sort of thing. The second would be IT, and then nonprofits is probably the third. We have small numbers in sectors like restaurants, construction, manufacturing. We're seeing more healthcare. In any case, that's the skew, white collar, but service sector and blue collar are also represented. And what's interesting is that the results don't seem to vary much by industry at all.
Now let's go into the interesting parts of the trials, meaning the outcomes. What are some of the key social, ecologic, economic, gender outcomes you see happening in these trials?
So we have two kinds of data collection. One is employee surveys. We have about 20 well-being measures. We also look at how people spend their time on the 4-day week schedule. Well-being measures are off the charts positive. 70% of people in these trials score lower on the burnout scale at endpoint. Physical health, mental health, positive emotions go up, negative emotions go down. Stress is reduced. Anxiety is reduced. Fatigue is reduced. People have fewer sleep problems. They sleep more. They exercise more frequently. They score higher on life satisfaction, job satisfaction, time satisfaction. And then also in the other direction, less work-family conflict, less work-life conflict. So those are all really strong. Interestingly, they don't vary that much by gender, by education, or race and ethnicity. On average, all of those groups are getting pretty similar improvements in all the well-being measures. So that's really interesting. It's not what we expected. We thought there would be big differences. Now, there are some interesting gender differences that we're seeing. For example, we are asking about the distribution of household work and childcare and a sort of how it works out within a household. Like, is someone doing more or less than their quote unquote fair share? And we're finding men are taking up a bigger share of household work to a very small extent, but childcare to a more significant extent. So there are some gender equity dimensions to this. That's, of course, been a big interest of women's groups who have been supporting the shift to a 4-day week. So that's the employee side.
Well, let's go deep into this last point on gender and household labor. Could the 4-day work week add to the responsibilities and the load put on the women? And I'm asking this especially in the context of extra labor, for example, childcare on the 5th day. During COVID lockdown, OECD data showed that mothers were almost 3 times as likely as fathers to report taking on the majority or all of the additional unpaid care work. Is this something you're factoring in your trials, or it's not the consensus so far?
Well, I'd say there's a lot of variation. I forget the fraction of parents in our sample, I think a third or something like that, people who have children at home. Most of those children are going to be in school on that 5th day. So for the most part, people have that day free. So that hobbies and leisure is number one, housework and childcare is the second activity, and then personal grooming, that's the third. That's an important part of the economics of this as well, because one of the things that happens is personal appointments that in the past people had to do during their working hours, like going to the doctors, they actually now can do in a 5-day week. Those are the main activities. There are people who are using the day to do more childcare because they want to, or because it's financially advantageous for them. We ask about childcare costs. There is a group for whom childcare costs go down because they spend the day with their own children. But that's the positive. For the most part, it's because they want to. So you want a situation in which people can continue with whatever childcare they have on that day if they want to use the day for themselves and not to take on the extra work of childcare. But it also makes possible in families where parents are working a lot and they don't feel they have enough time with their children. If the children are not in school, they can actually spend that time and in a less hurried way. Because one of the big reasons that this is so beneficial for people is that in contemporary society, where you have so many households with dual full-time earners, there's too much work on the weekend, whether it's childcare work or errands or housework, cooking, all of those things. We hear this phrase a lot, 2 days is not enough. And if we think back to another era where you had much more dedicated time, labor time in the household, because married women were not outside of the home working for pay, and they were able to combine, they might be doing some work for pay, but it would be combining tasks within the household. It's just too much. I'm looking at some of the data on US full-time dual earner householders. They're working 70 hours a week in paid and unpaid labor on average. It's just too much. And what's interesting about it is it's not just long hours workers who are having this problem. It's people who work ordinary schedules. So the modal schedule in our trials is 40 hours. It goes down to 32 during the trial, but just that 40 or a little bit more, plus all of that household labor, which on average is about as much in many countries. Well, certainly in my own, there's about as much unpaid labor being done as there is paid labor. This system is just too much work for people.
Okay, so we discussed the benefits of the 4-day week for the employees. Now let's talk about the employers and the companies. What are the draws of the 4-day week for them?
There are a number of different ways that it can be successful for the company or the organization. And that's important to remember because so many people go straight to productivity. But productivity is only one part of the overall performance for an organization. So what an organization needs to do to be successful with this is that the costs need to exceed the benefits, right? So that they have to do it in a way that is financially viable, economically viable for them. What the founders of the NGO that I've been working with, it's called 4-Day Week Global, they developed a model that they call the 100-80-100, which is 100% of the pay for 80% of the time, but you do 100% of the work. That's the sort of get more efficient and do 5 days work in 4. And that's where we started, and many of the companies are doing that quite successfully. Over time, I would say, and this is more anecdotal, just my sense of what's happened, as the labor market has gotten more challenging for employers in these countries that we're working in, there's another key dimension to this schedule, which is it allows them to retain people and to attract people, because employers are facing high levels of resignation of employees in many countries, so employees leaving, and also sitting with unfilled positions or having to pay so much more to get people. So a company can succeed with this even if they're not finding too many efficiencies because they save so much money on the turnover. Let me give you an example. An advertising and marketing company in Canada where the typical turnover on their teams is 30 to 40%. And they costed out what a person leaving costs, and that is about 30% of an annual salary, because they have all the costs of hiring, the costs of training and onboarding, the disruption to the team, etc. One of their teams went to our 4-day week schedule, did our program, 0 resignations since they started it. So they're saving enormous amounts of money. The first American company in our trial, it's a healthcare company. They don't do direct patient service. They're a nonprofit, but they operate according to a lot of standard business rules. They were facing a big resignation, and they didn't go through the onboarding process, but they just said, you know what? We need to do something to stop the bleeding. They put in a 4-day week, resignation stopped. There's a Kickstarter, which was the lead firm in our second trial. It's a US tech company. They were very invested in the whole idea of this for a variety of reasons. But since they put in the 4-day week, they have not had what is called a regrettable departure. In other words, somebody who left that they wanted to stay. They occasionally might push somebody out. They're in an industry which has average tenure, they say, of about 2 years. So it's a remarkable ability that they have now to keep people. And then companies are finding that they're getting many more applicants. One company that we've been studying here in Boston, this is a very hard place to get people because it's a high cost of living. They advertised for a position. The CEO told me that all of her friends were having difficulties getting anyone to apply for their jobs. They had 700 people apply for this 4-day week job. So it's a game changer.
To support these points, what are some of the concrete company metrics and outcomes you see coming out of your trials?
So company metrics. We asked for a couple of different kinds of data from companies. One is we asked them to rate the trial. So overall, how would you rate it? And then we asked for performance and productivity. And I would say in the early days, the trial rating was about a 9 out of 10. I think it's gone down to 8.5 now as we got many more companies. And productivity and performance are both at about 7.5 rating. They are pretty positive. We asked for a set of metrics that we thought everyone could give us. So revenue, absenteeism, new hiring, resignations, and energy use. So those are the 5. And those all look pretty good with some ups and downs. In the early days, the revenue was a lot better. It was partly coming out of COVID. And we were doing a comparison because as a 6-month trial where a lot of these companies have seasonal revenue patterns, you don't want to compare one half of the year with the other. Within trial, generally revenue does well, although sometimes it can be swamped by macro effects. Like the UK, our trial went on during a terrible economic time for the UK, so their revenue performance didn't look as good. I think the biggest metric for company success is the extent to which companies are continuing with this schedule. There are, at this point, I think only 10 companies out of 185 that have reverted to a 5-day schedule. And for a number of them, that's a temporary thing. They're planning to go back to it. But for the most part, tremendous success. And many companies telling us productivity has gone up, profitability has gone up, and it's a combination of some of the things I've talked about. Often companies will use this trial as a way to rethink everything they're doing and to stop doing things that are low value and focus on the high value things and change their strategic priorities. And that helps many of them become more profitable and viable.
We started this conversation saying that we need more integrated solutions to deliver on well-being, social, economic, and environmental accounts. So what are some of the most important environmental outcomes coming out of your trials?
We have less to report there. We just focused on carbon emissions. As anyone listening to this podcast who has tried to study carbon emissions knows, it's a very complicated question because it involves everything that we do. So we asked questions about commuting. We are seeing reductions in commuting by car, but not large. One reason is you have a lot of people already in this sample on remote, about 20% fully remote workers. So the fact that we're seeing even a little bit of commuting change, I think, is good. Second, we did collect some data on energy expenditures. We asked people if they are taking more environmental steps, like driving less, walking and cycling more. And we also asked about travel rebound, meaning do people travel more either domestically or internationally because they have 3 days off a week? We were worried, especially in Europe, cheap European flights, 3-day weekends, and so forth. So for the most part, we're not seeing travel rebounds. So I'm not so worried about that. We don't have a read on the household energy use. And now this will segue into the company data. We were trying to figure out what about the companies, because if they're shutting down on the off day, are they getting energy savings? And the data that came in on that was not usable. There were not enough. Some of these companies are in buildings where they're not paying their own electricity. It's part of their leasing agreements and so forth. So we weren't really able to figure that out. But that's an important thing. If the company is keeping its doors open with the same amount of energy and now an additional person is in the household, they're going to be using energy too. So that could be a rebound. But I would say overall, we're seeing some modest ecological improvement.
We're talking about policy trials and policy experimentation, and scale-up is a big part of this conversation. So let's talk about that. How replicable is the 4-day work week across industries and across countries with both advanced and developing countries in the mix? And what are some of the hitches and limitations to scale up?
I think it's viable everywhere, although if you take a country like India, where you have such a large fraction of the economy is in the informal sector, you would probably want to follow a different model. But what I would say at the same time is in those countries, work time reduction, not necessarily this model, but work time reduction is really important, because historically what we see is that if you have long hours, you can actually improve your hourly productivity by reducing them. And think about the development process. It is a process of productivity improvement and work time reduction that go together. So there's great scope for work time reduction in countries where you have still large numbers of people working very long hours. And I include parts of East Asia in this as well. I think that it's a financially viable strategy, so long as you're doing the kind of investment and rethinking the work process that allows people to be more productive. There's a lot more scope to expand in the sense that there are many more companies that I think could have the kinds of positive impacts that we've seen. I divide the companies into two types. One are those 100 companies, the ones that have enough, let's call them low intensity workplaces, where the intensity of work is low enough that you can reorganize and get everything done in the 4 days. At the other end of the spectrum, you have very high intensity workplaces. I call those the 180-80, 100% of the pay, 80% of the time, but only asking for 80% of the work. You can't speed these people up. There are no efficiencies to find. Think about nurses, doctors, healthcare, certain kinds of restaurant settings where they've already engineered these processes to be extremely efficient. The first restaurant chain in our trials, a very successful restaurant chain, they have a daily meeting, but it's a very efficient meeting and they need to do it. There's no time wasting going on there. But their chefs and their managers are working very, very long hours, 5 days a week, and they're burning out. We can think of these as sort of burnout jobs, and you can see it in the attrition rates for nurses, for healthcare workers, for restaurants. In the United States, in the Great Resignation, it was restaurant staffs who, kind of led the way and were the most visible group that were quitting. They go to 180-80 very successfully because their people are so much better off. And they may have to pay a little bit more in salary costs, but they make it up in turnover, in attracting talent, and also in quality of their services. So this is a really interesting thing that I found in these high burnout workplaces. Of course, we know quality suffers. We've seen it in the Nordic trials of nurses who got 6-hour days, and you get big improvements in patient quality. Or we've seen it in the Icelandic trials where the productivity of the services improved in many cases because people were less burned out. So those are the two ends of the spectrum. Very, very strong reasons to think it will succeed with them. And then you have everybody in between. Over time, the edges of those will start to move. And then you have that group in the middle. And that's where you need more help from government, because I don't think we've ever seen big changes in working hours historically that you didn't get some push from government. What government can really do, there are two things. In countries that are not sort of yet at a point where there's a consensus that could legislate change, government can sponsor trials like the ones we've been doing, but do it in such a way that you get those harder to get places, kinds of low wage companies, more on the blue collar. And then you can do randomized controlled trials, which we're not doing yet, but government can give incentives. And you already see governments starting this. You've got Spain, Portugal, Scotland. We're involved in researching Portugal, Scotland. In my own state here in Massachusetts, we have a bill going through for a study like the one that I've been doing. So that's my vision for how it scales up. Eventually, as more and more companies do it, the laggards get the market pressure to do it. So eventually they have to, if the momentum keeps up.
So when it comes to scale up, on one end of the spectrum, the answer is kind of easy. That's a reduction of work week from 5 to 4 days. Now, on the other side of that spectrum is the reduction of work week with hiring of other additional employees for the 5th day and throwing into the mix, if and as required, incentives and possible subsidies from the government.
Yes, but one thing about that hiring, it's not necessarily, just hire 20% more people like the ones that you have. Just expensive. They found much more creative ways to do things that still give that day off to people. So, for example, in the restaurant, their managers got a day off. They hired one extra hourly manager, which is less expensive than a salaried manager. And they promoted some of their people lower down to do some of the work that the chefs were doing. That created a new job ladder, which was a positive thing. They said the costs were really trivial.
Thank you very much for this. Now, let's go into deeper and more debatable waters, so to say. As we speak about the 4-day work week, there is a hand-in-hand question coming to my mind, and that is, what will people do with the extra free time? You talk about the mental health and the well-being benefits of the 4-day week, but with the mental health, the disintegration of social ties, the loneliness epidemics going on in so many countries, with some of them instituting even ministers in charge of loneliness and these portfolios, what will people do in the 5th day? Do you think there might be a risk that that extra free time may not be all positive and that it may push certain people further into self-isolation, more time spent on social media, loneliness, and all things associated with that?
I don't think so. No. People are finding these off days very, very satisfying. So they're getting into hobbies that may involve a lot of social interaction. They're getting into hobbies that they really enjoy. And one of the things about hobbyists is they tend to interact with other hobbyists. You might be joining a chorus to sing or a play group or something that's very, very social. Even if you're doing woodworking, which is a mostly solitary interaction, the more you get into your woodworking, the more likely you are to be reaching out to other woodworkers. Not everyone, of course, and they're having more quality time with their families, so that should abate loneliness. The one thing I think on issues of sociability is that it creates a little bit less opportunity for socializing in the workplace, which is an important antidote to loneliness. We ask about their connections to other colleagues in the workplace, and we just added new, much more explicitly socializing questions on the survey. How connected do you feel to other people in the workplace? We're not seeing reductions in that. Some of these companies are making very explicit attempts to build in socialization because they're a little bit worried that if people are getting more efficient, they're doing less that is interactive. And we're hearing that anecdotally from people in those workplaces where there's a lot of chit chat and social interaction, which is fun and nice. People would much prefer to have a more efficient workplace, get that time off, and then socialize with people. So no, I think if anything, it should improve because what's happening is people are exhausted. They don't have time to see people. One of the things we hear a lot from people about what they do on that off day is they visit friends and family. talking about how they're able to finally connect with their families because before they were always too busy.
Well, families and hobbies all sound good. It would be also interesting to look into more disaggregated data, including by age group and the use of extra time for isolating activities on social media and similar things. But let's go to the bigger picture now. The work reduction is just one policy idea in the bigger package of policies and reforms many say we need in the context of post-growth agenda. And you've talked about this and you worked on different kinds of interventions and policy areas, including carbon taxation and carbon dividends, decoupling the employment from welfare. And at some point I saw you even talked about universal basic income, which is a big work stream for us here at the UNESCO Inclusive Policy Lab. So could you tell us, besides the 4-day work week, what policies you think should be part of government thinking and reforms in this regard?
Well, let me start with climate. I've written in favor of tax and dividend and so forth, but I think at this point, the window for carbon tax as a viable solution to climate change has closed. And yes, we should have carbon taxes, but they have to be so high that they're extremely market disruptive. So a market approach to climate is no longer on the table as a feasible thing. We have to have programs of government investment in renewables and shutting down fossils, period. It's simple. It's not simple to get there. The politics of it are horrible. I am interested in working hours in significant part because degrowth agenda or a sort of post-growth agenda or whatever you call it, if we want to meet carbon emissions targets as set out by the IPCC, in rich countries, we have to stop increasing energy demand. We have to reduce it dramatically. How do you do that in a way that does not provoke yellow vest kind of political backlash? You do it by giving people something that's really valuable, but that is decarbonizing, and that is free time. Big part of why I'm working on this. The 4-day week is one step in what I hope will be progressive reductions in working hours. And I've done a lot of research showing that countries with low working hours have low carbon emissions, other things equal. Basic income, very interesting. I expected that we would see a lot of people in our studies taking on extra work during the off day. We do not at all. Even in countries like my own, where it's the place you would expect it most because we have a history of that. When workers got a 6-hour day back in the 1940s, I think it was with the Kellogg Company, it was men. They all went out and took on extra jobs. People are too busy now. But when this starts to filter down to really low-income workers, people who are really barely can get by, and we have lots of those in my country, I think fewer in Europe, but still some, they're going to have a lot of pressure to take on new work on that off day. And so I think a universal basic income is really important to get all of those well-being benefits of the 4-day week. They'd still be better off because they'd be making the same pay, they'll be getting more money, but they wouldn't be getting any more time. To make this a more egalitarian policy innovation that everybody gets to benefit from, you've got to raise those incomes for the lower folks. And I think I prefer a universal approach.
It's interesting that you mentioned Gilets jaunes here in France, meaning the yellow vests, because in my mind, it goes back to what you said in terms of your trials and covering primarily white-collar jobs. So if a 4-day work week or any reduction of working hours is introduced, it indeed has to be across industries and across types of jobs to gain the popular support it actually needs to go through. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, everybody wants it. It's just not everyone yet is getting it. Very few are getting it. And so that's my point about you have to have government involved in this for it to be equitable. There's no way that the market will just give it to everybody because the market power of low-wage workers is still so low. They can't even get a decent wage. They can't get anything really very decent. That's where you need government to come in and why you also need a universal basic income, so that if people do get this from their primary employer, they can actually benefit from it and not have to go out and earn more money.
Well, what you said wraps up very well this discussion about policy support. Everyone wants it. Now, who and how gets it is probably the trickier question. But Juliet, we're slowly reaching the end of this podcast, and we're usually finishing with recommendations. We have here for an audience both knowledge producers and policymakers. So if you are to address knowledge producers and researchers, what would be your pointers? What are the main knowledge gaps you think they should be looking into and covering when it comes to 4-day workweek?
Oh, there's so many. We're just at the beginning, really, of studying this with some of the other researchers who have been involved in our trials. We are starting Work Time Reduction Research Network, WTRRN. We're not live yet, but we encourage anyone who's interested in this to join us. We'll be doing a mini conference at the Society for the Advancement of Socioeconomics annual meeting in Limerick at the end of June. We're going to be starting a webinar series in January. The big areas are on the employee side to move beyond the self-reports to other kinds of more quote non-objective measures of well-being. And there are already people working on that. Our German collaborators are going to be using smartwatches to study. We have a collaborator who's doing MRI scanning of people who are getting 4-day weeks and seeing big improvements. That sleep is a big part of that. So that's one side. On the company side, we really have so much that we need to do to get better data. I think the bigger companies, as we get more bigger companies, they keep better data. So we'll get better data to put researchers into companies. We're trying to do that now to have more qualitative sense of how things are being implemented, to figure out better productivity measures, to look at those turnover data and do analysis of those, and to get randomized trials. So yeah, pretty much almost anything you can think of we need, because we're really just at the beginning of that, really kind of digging into what's going on. We have a very interesting finding, which is that people's self-reports of productivity soar from baseline to endpoint. Why is that? We don't know. We know it has a big impact on their well-being. Why do some people find they don't actually reduce their working hours? We have a small group who don't. What's that about? How do we understand the variation? We hear from very senior people that it's harder for them to reduce hours. So, all kinds of things.
And if you are to address the policymakers, and you talked a lot about the need for government intervention in these areas. So what would be your 1, 2, 3 pointers and recommendations to them?
Okay. Number 1, rigorous trials. Number 2, start looking at legislation to reduce standard work weeks or to discourage long working hours, giving incentives for companies that are going to a 32-hour week. There's a lot of social benefits that are not captured by the private sector, which creates a big argument for government trying to move us in this direction. I'll give one example. All of these people leaving healthcare because they're burning out. That's a huge social cost. I mean, we pay enormous amounts of money to train nurses and doctors, and that money is all wasted when they leave those professions. So government has an important role here to try and reduce the social costs of overwork. In the healthcare sector, we know how much the adverse health effects of long working hours and stress and burnout are. Government is the one paying ultimately. So social benefits, capturing the social benefits of this through subsidies and incentives.
Juliet, thank you very much. It has been a very, very interesting conversation. So thanks for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We reached the end of this episode. For more deep debate and data-driven solutions, follow the PolicyNet podcast on all major platforms.